This one moment proved Skylar White was never paranoid. She was the only one who actually understood the game. In the obsessive rewatch culture that Breaking Bad practically demands, the devil remains in the details, and so, apparently, does the money. Take, for instance, the curious appearance of the $50 bill, that middle-tier denomination that somehow manages to be both suspicious and forgettable. Season 4, Episode 7, Problem Dog. Walt, ever the suburban drug kingpin, shows up with a stack of cash to launder, thoughtfully disguised in cases of soda. Skylar, reluctantly inducted into the family business, doesn't miss a beat. She takes one look at the bills and snaps, "No one pays for a car wash with a 50. Her concern isn't the inconvenience of making change. It's that flooding a humble Albuquerque car wash with high-denomination bills is exactly how you invite IRS scrutiny, and perhaps a DEA agent or two. Fast forward to Season 5, Episode 13, Tohaji Lee. Enter Saul Goodman, criminal consigliere in a Bluetooth headset. He pulls into the same car wash, plays along with the facade, and, naturally, pays $14.97 for his full-service wash with a 50. Skylar, now teaching Walt Jr. the family trade, dutifully counts out the change. And there it is, the subtle callback, the quiet joke. A $50 bill, right where it shouldn't be. A lesser show might have dropped this detail for continuity. Breaking Bad turns it into character development. Skylar's earlier objection wasn't about the impossibility of a $50 car wash customer. It was about how repeated patterns of improbable behavior attract attention. A lone 50 is fine. Dozens? That's a paper trail with a neon sign blinking money laundering. And let's not forget who that lone customer is. Saul Goodman, who practically sweats plausible deniability, casually drops a 50 without a second thought. Of course he does. He operates in the same shady economy as Walt, paid in untraceable cash, stuffed in duffel bags, usually not in the most socially acceptable denominations. There's a poetic symmetry here. Walt tries to scrub his cash clean through a family business, and Saul rolls up with the same brand of dirty money, playing customer while reinforcing Skylar's fears. Some might call this a plot hole. It's not. It's reinforcement. Skylar's paranoia is validated. The cash doesn't lie, and the bills themselves tell a story. One of criminal carelessness dressed up as suburban normalcy. And for anyone laughing at the idea of a $50 bill being unusual, remember this. Back in 2008, you could still get a full car wash for under $15. Today, in the economic fever dream of 2025, you're lucky if it doesn't cost exactly a 50. Inflation has done what Skylar feared most, normalized the suspicious. So yes, someone does pay for a car wash with a 50, just not someone with anything to hide. Unless, of course, they have everything to hide. Everyone thinks Breaking Bad's timeline is unrealistic, but they're dead wrong. It's always impressive when viewers suddenly discover the timeline of Breaking Bad spans just 2 years, like they've cracked a secret code. The series begins on Walter White's 50th birthday and ends around his 52nd. It's not exactly a riddle wrapped in an enigma. It's spelled out from the pilot episode. Yet somehow, there's ongoing hand-wringing over whether the pace of events is realistic. Spoiler, it is. The first 4 seasons and the beginning of the 5th occupy roughly 1 year of in-universe time. The remaining episodes cover the next. Apparently, that's too much story for one calendar flip, because some viewers insist the compressed timeline defies believability. Clearly, they've never lived through a year of utter chaos, where everything falls apart, people change drastically, and entire lives unravel. For those who have, the show's pace feels less like fantasy and more like documentary. Yes, Breaking Bad is packed with action, transformation, and layered character arcs, but that's not a flaw. It's precisely what makes the timeline work. The illusion of longer time passing comes from how richly each moment is crafted. Much like the Beatles reinventing themselves with every album over just 7 years, the show delivers such intense evolution that it tricks the mind into thinking it's covering decades. It isn't, and it doesn't need to. Better Call Saul operates similarly, charting 2 dense years that encompass the collapse of HHM and the ominous rise of characters who would later populate Breaking Bad. Again, it's not unrealistic. It's just good storytelling. Now, onto the favorite exhibit for those crying implausible. Hank Schrader. He's shot 4 times, including in the spine, undergoes grueling physical therapy, wallows in mineral-fueled misery, survives a car crash, and eventually walks again. All in under a year. Incredible? Certainly. Impossible? Hardly. Medical recoveries, especially in high-stakes fiction, are as much narrative as they are clinical. And for a man as stubborn and obsessive as Hank, dragging himself out of a hospital bed just to chase one more lead is exactly the kind of exaggerated realism the show thrives on. So no, this timeline isn't some plot hole or oversight. It's deliberate, carefully plotted, and grounded in emotional and psychological realism rather than the literal ticking of the clock. If it feels fast, that's because the storytelling is efficient. If it feels long, that's because the show knows how to linger on moments that matter. Perhaps instead of marveling at the timeline's realism, or debating it with the fervor of a conspiracy theorist, one could simply accept that a year is more than enough time for a life to completely disintegrate, especially in Albuquerque. Breaking Bad didn't just expose a drug empire, it exposed the American healthcare system as the real cartel. For a show ostensibly about chemistry and crime, Breaking Bad manages to expose far more about American society than just the inner workings of a meth lab. Strip away the Emmy-winning performances and desert-drenched cinematography, and what's left is a 5-season indictment of systemic dysfunction, starring, among others, a chronically dishonest husband, a healthcare system best described as legalized extortion, and a pair of hitmen with the marksmanship of stormtroopers. Lesson 1. You can't lie to your wife. There's a recurring motif in Breaking Bad that's less subtle than a meth lab explosion. Walter White lies. Constantly. But the most ambitious fiction he ever attempts isn't cooking meth, it's trying to deceive Skyler. Time and again, the series underlines an apparently revolutionary insight. You cannot lie to your wife. And yet, Walter insists, repeatedly. It would be funny if it weren't so pathetic. Skyler knows. She always knows. Walter's delusion is less protecting the family, and more, watch me dig my own grave with each lie I tell. Lesson 2. Marco Salamanca is the worst hitman on earth. If there were a professional licensing board for cartel enforcers, Marco Salamanca would have flunked out on day 1. The man couldn't hit the broadside of an RV, even when it's sitting still in the middle of the desert. Perhaps the show meant it as tension. Instead, it plays like dark comedy. It's a miracle anyone feared him. He's less assassin, more decorative accessory to his more capable twin. Lesson 3. Apparently, RVs don't need brakes. Suspension of disbelief is one thing, but asking viewers to accept that an RV barreling through Albuquerque with no functioning brakes is somehow not an immediate death sentence? That's a bit rich. Then again, in a show where science and chaos cohabit, vehicular safety seems quaint, like worrying about your oil change while transporting several pounds of crystal meth. Lesson 4. U.S. healthcare is a luxury product masquerading as a necessity. Here lies the most brutal realism Breaking Bad offers. Walter White isn't driven to crime by greed. He's driven by the American healthcare system. A system that somehow turns a lobectomy and a short hospital stay into a nearly $1 million debt sentence. His case is fictional, but the math isn't. A cancer diagnosis routinely becomes a financial catastrophe. Even with decent insurance, the out-of-pocket burden can rival a down payment on a house. One might reasonably ask, if insurance doesn't prevent financial ruin, what exactly is it insuring? Lesson 5. Physical limits are optional, if you're a determined white male protagonist. Walter, fresh from cancer treatment and missing part of a lung, digs a 10 by 10 foot hole in the desert overnight, using only a pickaxe and sheer narrative willpower. For a man supposedly on the brink of death, he manages a remarkable amount of physical labor. It's less gritty realism and more myth-making. Heisenberg as demigod, too stubborn to die, too proud to stop. Honorable mentions in the absurd. Throwing a full pizza onto a roof? Bad idea. Faking a fugue state to escape legal consequences? Apparently genius. Trying to get a television signal in the frozen purgatory that is New Hampshire? Borderline tragic. These moments may seem absurd, but they serve a purpose. Highlighting a world where logic unravels under pressure, where desperation warps decision-making until it becomes indistinguishable from madness. Breaking Bad isn't just a crime drama. It's a dystopian mirror held up to a society where institutions fail and individuals are left to claw their way out, through lies, violence, or clever exploitation of their own mental health. Beneath the meth and monologues lies a far more unsettling truth. Walter White's descent is less an aberration and more a logical outcome of a system designed to break the weak and reward the ruthless. Hank Schrader isn't a hero. He's just Walter White with a badge. For a character so obsessed with justice, DEA agent Hank Schrader spends a suspicious amount of time trampling over the very laws he's sworn to uphold. Beneath the bravado and beer jokes lies a walking contradiction. A man who proudly moralizes about crime while bending, if not outright breaking, the rules whenever it suits him. Consider the moment he casually declares, "Pinkman gets killed, we get it all on tape." It's not the words themselves that chill. It's the ease with which he says them, the flippant disregard for human life tucked behind a badge. That single comment strips away any lingering pretense of respectability. His disdain for Jesse Pinkman isn't just professional, it's deeply personal. And it's not difficult to trace that contempt back to something uglier than just a war on drugs. But Hank's lack of empathy doesn't stop with Jesse. Take Wendy, the sex worker he mocks and dehumanizes. His treatment of her makes it clear. If you exist on the margins of society, Hank doesn't see you as a citizen, just a punchline. His early season antics, like taking bets on the race of suspects during surveillance, aren't just tasteless cop humor. They're profiling passed off his personality. And the consequence? He arrests the wrong man when Walt frames the school janitor. Charming. Of course, as the show progresses, so does Hank, or at least the facade of professionalism improves. But don't let the quieter demeanor fool you. His fundamental worldview remains unchanged. Criminals are less than. That worldview is what allows him to beat Jesse within an inch of his life without a shred of probable cause, only to walk away with a mild slap on the wrist. The truly frightening part? That scene isn't just effective television. It's disturbingly plausible. Real-world cops have done worse and face fewer consequences, often citing the all-purpose "I feared for my life" defense while walking free. And let's not pretend Hank didn't dip his own toes in the criminal pool. By the time he closes in on Walt, Hank is operating so far outside of legal bounds, he might as well be freelancing. He defies direct orders, manipulates witnesses, and detains Huel in what can only be described as a legally questionable human storage unit. The so-called arrest of Walt? It's riddled with enough procedural flaws to keep a real-world defense attorney employed for years. Had Hank followed proper protocol, maybe he and Gomi wouldn't have been left to face Jack's crew without backup. But that's the Schrader way. Improvise first, answer questions never. And yet, Hank is often propped up as one of the good guys, largely because his brother-in-law happens to be a meth-dealing, murder commissioning narcissist in a pork pie hat. Yes, Walter White is a monster, but that doesn't magically make Hank a hero. The show smartly refuses to let either man off the hook, but fandoms often do what narratives refuse: simplify complexity into virtue versus villainy. In that equation, Hank gets off far too easily. Perhaps most galling of all is his hypocrisy. He has no respect for criminals, unless, of course, they're his own family. Skylar's kleptomania? Treated with tender concern. She's working on her problem, after all. No beatings, no barbed jokes, no cameras sent to friends with crude captions. Just soft-spoken empathy from the same man who once treated Jesse like street trash. How fortunate that morality becomes so flexible when it's close to home. In the end, karma comes for Hank, but not before he's had ample opportunity to wield his badge like a blunt instrument. His death might be framed as tragic, but it's also a culmination of choices, many of them illegal, many of them indefensible. That's not just good storytelling. It's a realistic portrayal of how power corrupts when unchecked, how law enforcement can morph into law-breaking under the guise of righteousness. And no, Jesse Pinkman never pressed charges. But that's a TV myth. Victims don't get to press or drop charges. That's the DA's job. What Jesse did was refuse to testify, and that silence speaks volumes about how justice works when trauma is involved. Ultimately, Hank Schrader is less a martyr than a mirror, one that reflects the uncomfortable truth that the line between law enforcer and lawbreaker is often as thin as the paper their warrant should be printed on. This is exactly how Walter White could have walked free, even after confessing to murder. Let's entertain the hypothetical. Jack and his merry band of white supremacists never showed up in the desert. Hank and Gomez arrest Walt without interference. What then? Justice triumphs? Hardly. In reality, the so-called case against Walter White was less airtight indictment and more legal papier-mâché, held together by ambition, desperation, and a recording Jesse Pinkman made during an off-the-books operation that would make any defense attorney salivate. The problem is simple. Despite Hank's righteous fury and dogged pursuit, there was no compelling body of admissible evidence. The prosecution would be left leaning on a brittle scaffold of circumstantial ties. Jesse's testimony, from a former junkie with a well-documented vendetta and a broken nose courtesy of the arresting agent, and a recorded phone call in which Walt, frustrated and cornered, makes a series of damning admissions. But even that recording, the crown jewel of this unsanctioned crusade, is legally dubious. Jesse, not a cooperating witness, not under arrest, and certainly not acting under the DEA's authority, baited Walt into the conversation. This entire move was orchestrated outside proper protocol, without a warrant, without oversight, and with zero chain of custody. In other words, a procedural nightmare. Even in a one-party consent state like New Mexico, legality isn't solely about who hits record. A savvy defense would shred the credibility of the operation, and probably the admissibility of the evidence right along with it. Walt did indeed confess over the phone, to poisoning Brock, to several murders, and to the location of his buried fortune. It was the smoking gun Hank needed, except he never had permission to go looking for it in the first place. No warrant, no DEA approval, no official investigation. Just a rogue agent chasing the dragon of justice through the New Mexico desert. Would the evidence have stuck? Possibly. But Hank's career certainly wouldn't have. Launching a freelance investigation, coercing a former suspect into a sting without telling a single superior, then arresting the nation's most wanted meth cook without backup? Even if Walt went down, Hank's badge wouldn't survive the fallout. And then there's the messier matter of Hank and Jesse's shared history. A documented assault, a compromised relationship, a defense lawyer's dream. Any halfway competent attorney could argue coercion, bias, or worse. The recording, while legally permissible, becomes far more vulnerable once its origins are dissected under oath. Now, let's consider Skylar. With Walt out of the picture, would she testify? Almost certainly. The illusion of ignorance crumbles the moment Flynn throws her under the bus with his moral outrage. Skylar may not have seen drugs, but the money, the lies, the laundering, those aren't things she could plausibly deny forever. And yes, her fingerprints are likely on that cash. But for all the circumstantial evidence, physical proof is astonishingly scarce. No meth, no lab, no receipts. Just a trail of missing high school equipment and a gas mask found at a meth cook site. Hardly an open and shut case. This is a man who orchestrated a criminal empire, and yet the tangible proof of that empire evaporates with every scene. As absurd as it sounds, murder convictions have happened without a body, and this might have gone similarly, except Walt's empire was cash, not corpses, and even that vanished before the authorities could seize it. So when the show pivots into full-blown, nationwide manhunt mode in Ozymandias, it borders on the theatrically absurd. The DEA didn't have the kind of damning, courtroom-ready dossier that warrants wall-to-wall news coverage and a federal manhunt. They had a whisper campaign, a buried pile of money, and a phone call recorded during a possibly illegal operation. Even Hank admits the case was weak. But instead of fortifying it, he plowed forward, all fire and no foundation. The result? A dramatic shootout, 2 dead agents, and a meth kingpin on the run. The justice system didn't fail to catch Walt. It never had him in the first place. Oh, and as for Hank using the master bathroom, an unforgivable breach of guest etiquette, and frankly, the most disrespectful thing he did in the whole series. Forget the meth lab. This sandwich scene is the most disturbing moment in Breaking Bad. Among the many unsettling transformations in Breaking Bad, there's one quiet moment of character erosion that deserves more scrutiny than it gets. Walter White butchering a perfectly innocent sandwich. By Season 3, Episode 1, our meth kingpin casually lops off half the bread with surgical indifference and proceeds to call it lunch, as if the carcass of that sandwich wasn't a metaphor for everything he'd already dismembered in his life. Some have chalked this up to a subtle homage, Walt adopting the habits of those he's killed. It's a theory supported by his towel-on-the-floor vomit ritual, eerily echoing Gus Fring. But unlike Gus's clinical precision, Walt's crust cutting is oddly chaotic, excessive, and completely impractical. This isn't just mimicking, it's a man unraveling. A man whose guilt has not only hollowed out his soul, but apparently his sandwiches as well. Others have tried to excuse it as an expression of his newfound wealth. Perhaps, now that he's rich, bread is just another disposable commodity. After all, what's a slice of bread when you've got barrels of cash in your crawl space? Waste, in this world, becomes performance art. But even with all the money in the world, surely a man of Walt's once celebrated intellect could find a less ridiculous way to make a sandwich. Peel the crust, toast it, compost it, anything but this culinary massacre. Of course, there's the classic interpretation. Walt, riddled with guilt, is memorializing the dead with every crust he discards. But if that's true, it's hardly the poetic gesture it thinks it is. It's sloppy, half-hearted, like a high school production of Grief performed with Wonder Bread and a butter knife. The irony is almost too rich. A man once obsessed with precision and control now can't even make a sandwich without revealing the moral rot beneath his clean-cut exterior. Walt prides himself on being meticulous. His meth is 99.1% pure, his chemistry impeccable. Yet his sandwich preparation is a sloppy mess. The crusts aren't the problem, he is. And in the end, perhaps that's the point. In Breaking Bad, even the smallest domestic gesture, a sandwich made in silence, becomes a battleground for identity, guilt, and decay. Walt isn't just losing his morals, he's losing his palate, his sense of proportion, his very grasp on the ordinary. What's next? Microwaving steak? Using margarine? For a show obsessed with transformation, this throwaway moment is anything but. The crusts are cut, but it's Walt who's hollowed. Subscribe for more.